Welcome to True Crime Case Study, where we discuss the most incredible crimes. Today in the video, you will hear about the secret lesbian affairs of Jessica, the young new wife, who had a close relationship with her husband's 18-year-old daughter Tyra, and which ended in a terrible murder. Richard Newman, a 45-year-old successful businessman, had always prided himself on his ability to manage everything in his life with precision and control. But no amount of business acumen could save his marriage to Mary, his wife of 20 years. The divorce had been painful, but Richard emerged on the other side with full custody of his 18-year-old daughter, Tyra. His relationship with Tyra was strained. She was still reeling from the breakup of her parents and the upheaval in her life. Richard, eager to move on and fill the void left by Mary, soon found solace in the arms of Jessica. Jessica was everything Mary wasn't. Young, vivacious, and full of life. At just 28 years old, she had a magnetic charm that Richard found irresistible. Their whirlwind romance quickly led to marriage, and Jessica moved into Richard's luxurious home. For Richard, this was a fresh start, a chance to build a new family. But for Tyra, it was yet another disruption in her already chaotic life. She was beautiful in appearance, beautiful in figure, insanely good in bed. In a word, an ideal lover who later became Richard's wife. Tyra resented Jessica from the start. She saw her as nothing more than a gold digger, someone who was there to take advantage of her father's wealth and status. The age difference only made it worse. Tyra felt more like a rival than a daughter. Her unease was palpable, and she kept her distance, spending most of her time in her room, trying to avoid any interaction with her new stepmother. Jessica, on the other hand, was determined to win Tyra over. She was used to getting what she wanted, and she saw Tyra as a challenge. Jessica's initial attempts at bonding were superficial: shopping trips, spa days, and expensive gifts. But they did little to thaw the ice between them. Tyra was polite but cold, and Jessica quickly realized that this was not going to be as easy as she had hoped. Behind her smiling facade, Jessica harbored a secret. She had always been drawn to women, even though she had only been with men publicly. Her marriage to Richard was more of a strategic move than a romantic one, a way to secure her future. But the moment she laid eyes on Tyra, something stirred inside her, a mix of fascination and desire that she hadn't felt in years. Jessica's obsession with Tyra grew steadily, though she hid it well. She became more attentive, more involved in Tyra's life, trying to find any excuse to spend time with her. At first, Tyra found this annoying, but she eventually started to soften. Jessica was persistent, and despite her reservations, Tyra couldn't help but be drawn in by her stepmother's charm and attention. With Richard frequently away on business, the house felt like a world unto itself, shared only by Jessica and Tyra. Jessica took full advantage of Richard's absences, using the time to deepen her connection with Tyra. She began to anticipate Tyra's needs and desires, positioning herself as a source of comfort and support. Jessica cooked Tyra's favorite meals, left thoughtful notes for her, and offered to help with anything that might ease her burden. At first, Tyra remained guarded, suspicious of Jessica's sudden attentiveness. She was still mourning the loss of the family dynamic she once knew, and the last thing she wanted was to bond with her father's new wife. However, as time passed, Tyra found it harder to resist Jessica's overtures. The kindness Jessica showed her seemed genuine, and Tyra, who felt increasingly isolated, began to let her guard down. She started to open up to Jessica, sharing thoughts and feelings she hadn't voiced to anyone since the divorce. But Jessica's intentions were anything but pure. Her seemingly innocent gestures gradually became more intimate. Jessica started finding excuses to be close to Tyra, sitting just a bit too near on the couch, brushing against her in passing, letting her hand linger a second longer than necessary. These subtle actions were carefully calculated, designed to blur the lines between friendship and something more. One evening, while Richard was away, Jessica suggested they watch a movie together. Tyra agreed, appreciating the distraction. As they settled onto the couch, Jessica made sure to sit close, their legs touching. Throughout the movie, Jessica slowly inched even closer, her body pressing lightly against Tyra's. Tyra noticed but said nothing, unsure how to interpret the situation. As the movie progressed, Jessica took Tyra's hand in hers, holding it in a way that felt more intimate than comforting. When the movie ended, Jessica didn't move away. Instead, she turned to face Tyra, her eyes searching the young woman's face. The room was silent, the only sound the soft rustle of the curtains in the breeze. Jessica's hand slid from Tyra's hand to her thigh, her grip firm yet gentle. Tyra's breath caught in her throat as Jessica leaned in closer, her lips brushing against Tyra's cheek in a gesture that was far too familiar. Jessica whispered softly, her voice filled with warmth and affection, telling Tyra how beautiful she was and how much she cared for her. Tyra was by, but didn't know how to react. Frightened, she said that she urgently needed to go to the toilet, and for a while this incident was forgotten. The relationship between Jessica and Tyra takes a dark and unexpected turn. Jessica, aware of Tyra's struggles after her parents' divorce, and recognizing her own attraction to the young woman, begins to manipulate the situation. It starts innocently enough, with Jessica offering comfort and support to Tyra, presenting herself as a caring stepmother figure. However, beneath this facade, Jessica harbors her own desires, ones that soon become impossible for her to suppress. Jessica had always been perceptive, and she noticed the subtle signs that Tyra might share her attraction. The glances that lingered a moment too long, the way Tyra blushed when Jessica complimented her, and the way she seemed to seek out Jessica's company despite their complicated family dynamics. These signs were enough to embolden Jessica, who began to push the boundaries of their relationship ever so slightly. It started with small, seemingly harmless touches, a hand on the shoulder that lingered a bit too long, a playful brush of fingers against Tyra's arm. Jessica was careful, ensuring that each move could be interpreted as innocent if necessary. But Tyra, struggling with her own feelings, felt the tension growing between them. She had known she was a lesbian for some time, but had kept it hidden, fearing how her father and society would react. Jessica's attentions both excited and terrified her. One evening, while Richard was away on a business trip, Jessica saw her opportunity. She found Tyra alone in her room, scrolling through her phone, lost in thought. Jessica knocked lightly before entering, a soft smile on her lips. She sat down on the bed beside Tyra, their thighs almost touching. The conversation started off normal, Jessica asking about Tyra's day, her classes, her friends, but there was an underlying tension in the air. As the conversation drifted, Jessica slowly steered it towards more personal topics, asking Tyra about her relationships, her experiences, and subtly hinting at her own. Tyra, feeling a mix of nervousness and curiosity, hesitated but eventually opened up. She spoke about her confusion, her fears of not being accepted, and her struggles with her identity. Jessica listened intently, offering comfort and understanding, but her words were laced with something more, a seductive undertone that Tyra couldn't ignore. Jessica's hand found its way to Tyra's, fingers interlocking as she reassured the young woman that there was nothing wrong with who she was. Tyra looked into Jessica's eyes, seeing the warmth and understanding there, but also something deeper, something darker. Jessica leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper as she told Tyra that she was beautiful, that she deserved to be loved and accepted for who she was. Before Tyra could fully process what was happening, Jessica's lips were on hers. The kiss was soft at first, testing, but when Tyra didn't pull away, it deepened. Tyra's heart raced as she kissed Jessica back, a flood of emotions washing over her: fear, excitement, desire. All the confusion and tension she had been feeling seemed to melt away in that moment. The kiss quickly escalated, and Jessica, sensing Tyra's growing passion, took control. She gently guided Tyra back onto the bed, their bodies pressed together. Tyra's mind was spinning, but she didn't resist. For the first time in a long time, she felt wanted, accepted. The feelings she had been hiding were finally coming to the surface, and Jessica was there to embrace them. As their clothes began to fall away, Jessica's touches became more intimate, more possessive. Tyra, lost in the moment, responded with equal intensity. The two women explored each other's bodies, their movements a mix of urgency and tenderness. Jessica, experienced and confident, led the way, while Tara, though nervous, found herself giving in to the pleasure and the thrill of the forbidden. Mary had always been a practical woman, and when her marriage to Richard ended, she accepted the divorce with a level of grace that surprised even herself. She knew their relationship had run its course, and although the pain of separation was deep, she chose to focus on the well-being of their daughter, Tyra. Tyra had been at the center of Mary's thoughts throughout the divorce, and as difficult as it was, Mary resolved to ensure that her daughter's life remained as stable as possible. Mary's concern deepened when she observed how Jessica interacted with Tyra. At first, it seemed like Jessica was making an effort to bond with her new stepdaughter, but something about the way she did it felt off. Jessica's attentions were too focused, too intense. She was always finding reasons to be alone with Tyra, offering to take her shopping, or inviting her out for lunch. To an outsider, it might have looked like Jessica was simply trying to build a relationship with Tyra, but to Mary, it felt more like Jessica was trying to pull Tyra away from her. Richard, of course, was oblivious to all of this. He was smitten with Jessica, and any concerns Mary raised were brushed aside as jealousy. Mary tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that she was just being protective of Tyra. But the unease never left her. She had accepted the divorce, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with Jessica. Mary noticed how Tyra started to change after Jessica came into their lives. Her once confident daughter seemed more uncertain, more hesitant. There were times when Tyra would seem lost in thought, her usual spark dimmed. When Mary asked her about it, Tyra would brush it off, saying everything was fine. But a mother's intuition is strong, and Mary knew that something was troubling her daughter. She knew she had to tread carefully. Richard had moved on, and she didn't want to be seen as the bitter ex-wife meddling in his new relationship. But Tyra's well-being was her top priority, and if there was even a chance that Jessica was causing her harm, Mary was determined to find out. Even as she tried to remain calm and rational, Mary's instincts told her that Jessica was trouble. The easy charm, the subtle manipulations, the way Jessica seemed to want to control Tyra's life, it all pointed to something dark beneath the surface. Mary couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but she knew she had to stay vigilant. Intimate encounters between Jessica and Tyra had grown more frequent, deepening a connection that was kept hidden from the outside world. Richard, a busy businessman often consumed by his work, had no idea what was unfolding in his own home. One day, Mary decided to visit her daughter, wanting to check in and see how she was doing. When she arrived at the house, she noticed Richard's car was absent from the driveway. She tried calling Jessica to let her know she was there, but there was no answer. After waiting a few moments, Mary decided to try the door. To her surprise, it was unlocked. Hesitant but concerned, Mary stepped inside and called out for Jessica. The house was unusually quiet. As she began to climb the stairs, a sense of unease washed over her. When she reached the top, she noticed that the door to Tyra's room was slightly ajar. From inside, she could hear faint, yet unmistakable, sighs and soft women moans. With her heart pounding, Mary carefully approached the door, pushing it open just a crack to see what was happening. The sight that met her eyes was shocking. Tyra and Jessica were intertwined on the bed, their bodies close, engaged in an intimate act. The realization of what she was seeing hit Mary like a cold wave. Her daughter, Jessica, was involved with Tyra, Richard's wife. The horror of it all was overwhelming. Mary felt her breath catch as she backed away, her mind racing to process the scene before her. Terrified and shaken to her core, Mary fled down the stairs and out of the house, her thoughts in disarray. The implications of what she had just witnessed were devastating, and she knew this discovery would have profound and far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Mary had always considered herself a strong woman, one who could weather life's storms with resilience and grace. But this betrayal had tested her limits. The discovery that Richard, her ex-husband, was being deceived by his new wife, Jessica, left her in a state of shock. The situation was further compounded by the horrifying realization that Jessica's affair involved their daughter, Tyra. The thought alone was enough to ignite a deep, seething anger within Mary. After days of sleepless nights and unrelenting contemplation, Mary decided that she could no longer remain a passive observer. Action was necessary, and she would be the one to take it. Carefully, she planned her approach, choosing a day when Tyra would be out of the house. She knew that this confrontation needed to happen away from Tyra's presence, sparing her daughter from the immediate trauma of what was to come. With a sense of grim determination, Mary drove to the house where she had once lived, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As she parked in the driveway, a slight tremor coursed through her, but she steeled herself. There was no room for hesitation now. This had to end. Mary rang the doorbell, and when Jessica answered, the brief flicker of surprise in her eyes did not go unnoticed. The mask of cordiality that followed only solidified Mary's resolve. Inside the kitchen, they sat across from each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. Mary wasted no time, her mind focused on the task at hand. She revealed that she knew everything, that she had seen Jessica with Tyra in the bedroom. The truth was out, and it hung in the air like a dark cloud. Jessica's face drained of color as the weight of Mary's words sank in. The carefully constructed life she had built was suddenly at risk of crumbling. Panic set in as she realized the full extent of the threat Mary posed. The thought of losing Richard, the man who provided for her, and the thought of losing her secret relationship with Tyra sent waves of fear coursing through her. Mary's expression remained cold, her eyes fixed on Jessica with unwavering intensity. There was no room for negotiation, no room for compromise. Jessica's pleas fell on deaf ears as Mary made it clear that this deception would end, and it would end now. Jessica was to confess everything to Richard, or Mary would do it herself. The ultimatum was delivered with an air of finality that left no doubt about Mary's intentions. Desperation began to bubble up within Jessica. She needed a way out, a way to stop Mary from ruining everything. As she realized that Mary wouldn't be swayed, a dark thought took hold. If she couldn't manipulate Mary, perhaps she could intimidate her. Jessica's mind twisted in fear and anger, and she issued a threat, warning Mary that if she spoke a word of this to Richard, Tyra would suffer the consequences. That was the breaking point. Mary's anger, already simmering beneath the surface, erupted with a force she hadn't known she was capable of. Without thinking, she struck Jessica across the face, the blow sending her stumbling to the floor. The act was swift and driven by a primal need to protect her daughter from the evil that Jessica had become. Mary stood over her, her voice trembling with rage as she made it clear that no harm would come to Tyra, not while she was alive to prevent it. As Mary turned to leave, ready to walk away from the confrontation, Jessica's mind raced with panic. This was her last chance. She couldn't let Mary leave, not with the power to destroy everything she had so carefully orchestrated. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a solution, until they settled on the heavy metal mallet Richard had left on the kitchen counter after some recent home repairs. In a moment of frenzied desperation, Jessica grabbed the mallet. The realization that this was her only option propelled her forward. Without hesitation, she swung the mallet with all her strength, bringing it down on Mary's head with a sickening thud. Mary staggered, then fell to the floor, blood pooling around her as the second blow landed. The sight of Mary lying motionless filled Jessica with a cold, detached sense of relief. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the consequences of her actions were only just beginning to unfold. Jessica stood over Mary's lifeless body, her chest heaving as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. Panic gripped her as she stared at the blood slowly spreading across the kitchen floor. This wasn't supposed to happen. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, for some way to cover her tracks and make it look like she had nothing to do with Mary's death. The situation was dire, but Jessica knew that if she didn't act quickly and logically, everything she had worked so hard to build would be destroyed. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to think clearly. The first step was to get rid of any immediate evidence that could directly implicate her. Jessica glanced at the mallet still clutched in her hand, now stained with Mary's blood. She couldn't simply leave it lying around. She wiped it down with a kitchen towel, carefully removing her fingerprints before placing it back on the counter. The mallet wasn't something unusual in the house. It was a tool Richard had used recently. She knew she had to make it seem as though Mary's death was a tragic accident. Jessica quickly assessed the scene, trying to make sense of the chaos. She decided to stage the scene as a break-in gone wrong. The idea was simple and had the potential to explain Mary's presence and the ensuing violence. Jessica needed to create a scenario where it appeared that Mary had been attacked by an intruder while visiting the house. To make this believable, she needed to create signs of forced entry. She hurried to the front door, which was still locked, and grabbed a crowbar from the garage. Jessica jammed the crowbar into the doorframe, prying it open with enough force to splinter the wood around the lock. The damage had to look convincing, as though someone had forcibly entered the house. She took care to avoid leaving any fingerprints on the crowbar, wiping it down thoroughly before returning it to the garage. Next, Jessica turned her attention to the inside of the house. She needed to create the appearance of a struggle, something that would suggest Mary had surprised the intruder and tried to defend herself. Jessica knocked over a few chairs in the kitchen and scattered items across the countertops. She then took a few valuables, a laptop, some jewelry, and cash from a drawer, placing them in a bag she found in the closet. The idea was to make it look like a robbery that had escalated into violence, when Mary had the misfortune of interrupting the thief. The blood on the floor was a problem. Jessica knew she couldn't clean it up entirely, as that would raise suspicion. Instead, she needed to make it look like the attacker had fled in haste, leaving the scene as it was. She decided to track some of the blood through the house to the front door, creating a trail that suggested the intruder had fled after the attack. Using a pair of gloves, she carefully dipped her fingers into the blood and smeared it across the doorknob, further reinforcing the idea that someone had left the house in a hurry. As she worked, Jessica realized she needed to account for the timing of Mary's death. She needed to establish an alibi that would place her far away from the house at the time of the murder. Quickly, she checked the time on her phone and made a mental note. Jessica then composed herself and called Richard, feigning a calm tone as she asked him if he could pick up a few things from the store on his way home, something innocuous to explain why she might have been out. To further solidify her alibi, Jessica decided to leave the house for a short while. She drove to a nearby convenience store, where she made a small purchase, ensuring that she would be captured on the store's security cameras. The timestamp on the receipt would help support her claim that she wasn't home at the time of the incident. She then drove back to the house, careful to act as though nothing was amiss when she returned. Before entering, she took a moment to gather herself. Her plan was almost complete, but she knew that the most critical part was still ahead. She had to call the police and report what had happened. Jessica rehearsed the story in her mind, making sure she had every detail straight. When she felt ready, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Her voice trembled as she spoke to the dispatcher, explaining that she had just returned home to find the door forced open and the house in disarray. She mentioned that her husband's ex-wife, Mary, had come by earlier to talk, but that she hadn't expected anything like this. She described the scene in the kitchen with horror, emphasizing how she had found Mary's body lying in a pool of blood. Jessica made sure to express shock and disbelief, portraying herself as a distraught witness to a horrific crime. When the police arrived, Jessica played her part flawlessly. She was cooperative, answering their questions and providing details that supported the story she had fabricated. She even expressed concern for Tyra, suggesting that the intruder might have targeted Mary because of her visit and that Tyra might have been in danger if she had been home. The police noted her genuine seeming distress, which only further convinced them that she had nothing to do with the crime. As the investigation unfolded, the police found evidence that seemed to support Jessica's story. The forced entry at the door, the scattered items in the kitchen, and the blood trail leading to the front door all pointed to a robbery gone wrong. The mallet, a common household tool, didn't raise immediate suspicion, especially given the other apparent signs of a struggle. The lack of obvious fingerprints only added to the mystery, making it seem as though the intruder had been careful, possibly wearing gloves. Jessica had meticulously crafted her cover-up, But in her haste and desperation, she made subtle mistakes that didn't escape the attention of Detective Morgan, a seasoned investigator known for his keen eye for detail and his methodical approach to solving crimes. When Detective Morgan arrived at the scene, the first thing that struck him was the mallet used in the crime. It was a common household tool, but something about its presence nagged at him. During his initial walkthrough, he noted that the mallet had been wiped clean of fingerprints. In his experience, this was unusual. In a typical break-in, the intruder would likely act quickly, using whatever was at hand, and would rarely take the time to wipe down a weapon if they were fleeing the scene. The absence of fingerprints on the mallet suggested that whoever used it had the presence of mind to cover their tracks, something that didn't align with the chaotic nature of the supposed robbery. As he continued to examine the kitchen, Detective Morgan noticed another inconsistency. The mallet, a blunt instrument, seemed like an odd choice of weapon for an intruder in a kitchen full of sharp knives. Why would an intruder choose a heavy mallet over a more accessible, potentially more lethal weapon? It didn't make sense unless the person who used it had a reason to avoid leaving an obvious weapon behind. Someone who knew the house well and was aware of the mallet's presence. Morgan's suspicions deepened as he examined the signs of forced entry. The front door had clearly been damaged, the wood splintered around the lock. However, the more he looked at it, the more the break-in seemed too clean. The crowbar marks were precise, almost as if someone had taken their time to create them. In genuine break-ins, there were usually signs of a struggle, scuff marks, uneven force applied to the door, and damage extending beyond the lock area. But here, the damage was contained and methodical, which didn't align with the idea of an intruder in a hurry. Morgan's instincts told him something was wrong. He scanned the rest of the house, noting scattered items and overturned furniture. Again, the scene seemed staged. The valuables that were believed to have been stolen were the laptop and cash. The jewelry, however, was untouched. Experts estimated that there was at least $15,000 worth of jewelry in the house, and none of it had been touched. The blood trail leading to the front door was another point of interest. While it seemed to suggest that the intruder had fled after the attack, Morgan found it curious that the trail was so precise, almost as if it had been placed rather than naturally occurring. In many cases he had worked on, blood patterns were messy, with smears and droplets that told the story of a chaotic escape. But here, the trail was too neat, too convenient, as if someone had carefully smeared the blood to suggest a hasty departure. Morgan's final piece of the puzzle came when he reviewed the security footage from the convenience store where Jessica claimed to have been during the time of the murder. While the timestamp on the receipt matched her story, the footage showed her demeanor as calm and collected. She made her purchase quickly and efficiently, without the signs of distress one would expect from someone who had just found their ex-husband's wife brutally murdered in their home. It struck Morgan as odd that Jessica hadn't called the police immediately after discovering the scene, but had instead taken the time to create an alibi. In one of her statements, she slipped, mentioning the mallet in a context that she shouldn't have known about if she had indeed discovered the scene after the fact. Morgan seized on this slip-up, questioning her further until her carefully constructed story began to crumble. The psychological strain of maintaining her lie eventually wore her down, and Jessica, realizing she was cornered, confessed to the crime. In the end, it was Jessica's own efforts to conceal the murder that led to her downfall. Her attempt to outsmart the investigators only highlighted her guilt, as the inconsistencies in her cover-up were too glaring for an experienced detective like Morgan to overlook. Jessica was arrested and charged with Mary's murder, her once perfect life shattered by the very crime she had tried so hard to hide. Richard was driving home after a long day at work when his phone rang. Glancing at the screen, he saw the number from the local police department. A sense of dread washed over him as he pulled over to the side of the road, his hands trembling slightly as he answered the call. The voice on the other end was calm, but carried a weight that immediately set him on edge. It was Detective Morgan. As the detective spoke, Richard's heart sank. He was told that there had been an incident involving Mary, his ex-wife. The detective's tone made it clear that this was serious. When the words finally came, they hit Richard like a physical blow. Mary had been found dead, the victim of a violent crime. The reality of it took a moment to sink in. Mary, the woman he had once shared his life with, the mother of his child, was gone. Richard felt a wave of shock and disbelief crash over him, leaving him momentarily unable to speak. After a few minutes of deep breathing, he called Tyra and said that he's need to pick up her and tell her something. Tyra looked at him, her concern growing as she sensed something was terribly wrong. Richard gently held her hands and, with great difficulty, told her what had happened. He explained that her mother was gone, that she had been killed earlier that day. At first, Tara seemed unable to process the words. She just stared at him, as if trying to make sense of something impossible. Then, the reality hit her, and she broke down, sobs racking her body as the shock and grief overwhelmed her. Richard pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried. His own tears fell as he tried to comfort her, though he knew there was little he could do to ease the pain she was feeling. Next, Richard will have to find out who really committed this atrocity, and Tyra will have to reveal her secrets. Richard and Tara still have to find out on the spot who exactly killed such a person dear to them. This news will shock them to the core.